Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nero, AJ here, and I'll admit here and now that this was a somewhat difficult one to write up owing to the multitude of parallel plot strands that comprise the storyline of Warmachine Hordes, the tabletop skirmish game. Tying them together in a summary form with more or less equal focus on every materially invested faction, as far as the in-world international and diplomatic dynamic is concerned, was fun, don't get me wrong, but a little more difficult than normal, nonetheless, because of the relative brevity of these videos. A bit more reading was done in preparation compared to previous installments of this series, thanks to there being expansions that built on the story, setting and characters through 2 full editions of the game. And as with the previous broad period of Imre's history, this part, which only covers a couple of decades, is split into 2, with the cutoff point being around the time of Colossals and Gargantuans, which again is chosen because of the narrator's biases. Unlike before, however, sections are divided based more on major factions rather than point in time, since this is a much narrower period that will be covered. We enter a period in which every nation and every race of Immoren would be plunged into war, whether it be of their own design or thanks to the action of others. That is, with the exception of the giants. Though one, a scholar called Immoren, was captured by the Scorn, he refused to fight and betrayed nothing of his fellow people of Menoth. Nevertheless, it is with Scorn that I will start. The fugitive, Winter Railthorn, recently deposed as King of Signar, fled east, managing to escape his pursuers, agents of Leto and his scout general Ribold. By some superhuman feat of endurance, Winter survived the crossing of the Blundstone Desert, and even made the crossing over the forbidding abyss, and arrived in Scorn territory. As a cunning individual, he quickly realized Scorn attitudes and used them against the people of the East, challenging nobles that he encountered, one by one, to usurp their power. Tyrants, Lord Tyrants, and even Dominars fell to him until he arrived in Halark, and even the Archdominars, Makeda Balash chief among them, were unable to challenge him, whereupon he took the title of Supreme Archdominar. His plan to retake the Signaran throne was in full motion as he sold the idea of conquest westward to his hosts as a challenge. A destiny of sorts, something befitting a warrior race that had granted him the epithet of conqueror. Under his authority, the Scorn was reorganized into an empire, unified for the first time in their history, even if there was the occasional dissenter here or there that the pain-givers duly dealt with. After leaving Signar with nothing, he returned 9 years later with a Scorn host at his back, and with it he invaded. Though initially successful, the invasion stalled after the conquest of Corvus by a force I understand to be composed of the raised dead, though not of the same ilk as Crixian thralls. They disrupted Winter's plans long enough for the Signaran army to come to the city's aid and push the Scorn back beyond the Combs Beacon. There they would remain, always a thorn in the side of Signar and the protectorate of Menoth in an area dubbed the Western Reaches. Unfortunately for Winter, though, because of his desire to regain the throne overriding all other considerations, his rule did not go unchallenged in far-off Halark. Though Makeda remained loyal, she too would finally rebel against the conqueror when the master of the pain-givers, Morgul, discovered Winter's treachery and the true nature of his assault on Signar. The Scorn would now refer to him as the betrayer, and Makeda usurped his authority, returning rule of the Scorn to an Archdominar of the Scorn. She assumed his title of Supreme Archdominar, maintaining an iron grip on the power despite the nature of Scorn politics, keeping those changes to their society that she saw as beneficial to her and her rule. Under her, the Scorn really would expand westward for true conquest, not the petty ambitions of the deposed king of a severed human kingdom. However, despite Winter now being a fugitive from 2 major powers of Immoren, and the Scorn emboldened by renewed unity and purpose, they struggled to break through Signaran defences after an assault on Fort Falk. Because of these setbacks, the Scorn turned their attention to other potential targets of conquest, including the North and Dios. But the Scorn were not Signar's only headache during this time of upheaval. The nightmare experienced by Signar's military hierarchy was only just beginning. Barely a year after the sudden appearance of the Scorn from the deserts of the east, as ordered by their Queen Ain XI, Khadoran forces launched a surprise attack against Lael, still insistent on returning Umbri in its entirety to their Cardic legacy. Still dependent on their old allies for military support, Lael was caught completely unawares by the strategic plans of Gervalt Irisk and desperately appealed to Signar for reinforcements, who did their best to oblige. Losses suffered against the Scorn that prevented a greater commitment of manpower. The rapid Khadoran advance and growing unrest at the Signaran Protectorate border spelled disaster, though, and within a year Irisk's forces had annexed fully half of Laeli's territory, including all of Laeli's Umbri. The Signorans were forced to retreat with their tails between their legs as Lael surrendered, ceding the lost territory to the newly formed Caedoran Empire. For the defeated Lael, their ordeal was also only just beginning, despite the valiant efforts of the resistance, under the symbolic leadership of Ashlyn de Lys, and with the tacit political support of Duke Delriv, who led the country in lieu of a monarch and formal government, from Ridden. While elements of the Signoran army were racing north to aid their beleaguered neighbours, Hierarch Voil, the ambitious leader of the Protectorate, took this opportunity to declare a great crusade against those of Western Immoren that had forsaken the Creator. The first target was the people of the Protectorate's western neighbour. So started the Caspia-Sul War of 604 AR, with the assault on the walls of Caspia. And though the Sulmenites ultimately failed in this attempt to conquer Signar's capital, things within Signar's military had to change to be able to withstand this onslaught on so many fronts, and it became a matter of adapt or die. And indeed they did. King Leto authorised the creation of a new and strategically flexible division that was large enough to be counted as an army, and it would serve as a fast response task force that could exploit Signar's internal communications to be deployed at short notice. This was the Storm Division, composed of the voltaic weapon-armed soldiers of Signar's elite. Their commander, Common Striker, led them in a successful defence of Caspia and then the Signaran south at large against the Protectorate's forces, and the tide of war eventually turned as the Signaran army started a campaign against Sul. Indignant at such a turn of events, Voil launched a vicious counterattack that saw Leto wounded in battle, but ultimately the Hierarch met his end during this last phase of the war, killed in battle by Lord Commander Striker, though some claim perfidy and dishonour on the Signaran officer's part, a matter that is still controversial even now. Shaken by the death of the Hierarch, the Protectorate agreed terms. But the Protectorate would collide in war against Cador and Lael, as well with the former's declaration of the Northern Crusade. Under the then Grand Scrutator Severius, in the name of bringing the law of Menoth back to the faithless, a large contingent of the Protectorate's invasion forces marched north, through the Thornwood and even into Ward as the Moran Abbey of Felig was burned to the ground, Felig having only recently come under the control, or protection depending on who one asks, of Ordic mercenary forces after they ejected the Caedoran detachment of the Northguard invasion army. The fate of Felig would be another headache for the Signoran crown and government. Eventually, the Crusade allied itself with the Laelese resistance to repel the Caedoran invasion, only to ignore Laelese territorial claims and declare Lerin the seat of the Northern Crusade, with the intention of returning mankind of the North to Menoth's embrace, one province at a time, starting with the Rhinish. The Laelese, it appeared, had traded one invader for another. Severius, though, soon took on the responsibilities of Hierarch upon Voil's death, but remained firm in his belief that it was his duty to personally command the Northern Crusade, leaving the Protectorate's other active forces under senior leaders such as the Grand Exemplar Kreos and Fiora, Protector of the Flame, to continue the task of weakening the presence of the other faiths in Signar. A nation under fire from almost every direction, Signar also discovered the true extent of the incursions made by the Crixians. Almost too late, the CRS and the military command learned that the Shard invasions and subsequent assaults along the Signoran coastline were an elaborate ruse for at first small landings by Crixian forces to the north in less populated areas, and by the time a full response could be organised, the armies of the Dragonfather were already firmly entrenched. The three incursions, led at the time by Lich Lords Venethrax, Terminus and Deomortus, would terrorise the region for some years, but despite the broad unity of purpose, the Crixians themselves were not immune to fractiousness, as these commanding Lich Lords jostled with each other for military resources and the Dragonfather's favour. Taking advantage of the politicking, Asphyxius, the ambitious Iron Lich who would go on to contact the elusive Cephalix to serve as yet another diversion for the mortals of Western Immoren, usurped his master, the Lich Lord Deomortus, and would allegedly be responsible for the destruction of another. Though it was rumoured that the former Lich Lord was sealed into his successor's weapon, I had and have little desire to discover whether this is true, despite what became of Asphyxius in the years since. But it was after he was raised to be one of the 12 Lich Lords that Crixian goals in the Immerese mainland, at least their immediate goals, became known, drawn by the necromantic power emanating from an Orgoth temple close to Fisherbrook, south of the Thornwood. The presence of Crixian undead labourers and a Lich Lord's forces precipitated the arrival of armies from the three nations that fought for control of that territory. The armies of mankind, with no few dwarves among them also, were suspicious of each other, but even more suspicious of Crixian intentions. They skirmished amongst each other around the town and the ruins, and amidst the fighting attacked the Crixians, almost in unison, unintentionally undoing Asphyxius's efforts and driving his undead legions from the temple. I've yet to discover the truth of whether this was some miracle ordained by all the gods of humanity and dwarven kind, or a continuation of the competing schemes of the Lich Lords. And as with all things Crixian, I am loath to explore this matter too deeply. Even within the contested and ostensibly unpopulated lands of Immoren, war erupted. The long-rumoured Circle Lawbros stirred unrest among the Cholkin Creoles, some amongst the Thornwood, but also some within the Gnarls. But due to treaties made between senior chieftains and King Luto during the early years of his reign, many Creoles, an alliance of which were led by Magic Ironhide, remained loyal, and conflict broke out between the Cholkin and the Circle's vassals, tribes of Tharn and other Devira cultists. In and amongst this, bands of Pharaoh, Gatormen, and Bogtrogs sold their services to whoever could pay, though some chieftains and petty warlords tried to unite their races to fight for their lands which were trampled by the armies of mankind that fought their way through. There were even some, known as the Croaks, from the far southeast of Immoren, formerly slaves of the Scorn, who joined in these efforts as allies of the Gatormen. All the while, the various forces of the Iron Kingdom skirmished throughout these same lands, looting what was once occupied, sacking what was once looted, and razing to the ground what was once sacked, until some areas were but a scar on the landscape. To the north, Etherin Baal, now to be known as Everblight, was unearthed from his mountain prison. At his command, Vale Helir poisoned the rivers of the Spire Shards with the dragon's blighted blood and corrupted her fellow Nis. The Winter Elves, already few in number, tore themselves apart as untainted Shardfolk defended themselves from their blighted neighbours. Priests, understanding the gravity of what occurred, fled, taking as much ancient lore with them as they could, along with as many artefacts as possible, first and foremost among them being the Vault of Nisor. The dragon counted this as a failure, for the strength of an elven god, even one weakened as Nisor was, would be of great use to him. The Nis refugees fled southwest, with many ending up in Korsk, welcomed by the Moran priesthood there. By this time, though, Everblight had turned his attention to more achievable and lucrative goals. Among the things he learned shortly after the formation of the latest iteration of his legion was the location and state of his brother dragon Pyromalphic. After his battle against the Orgoth some 840 years before at the Castle of the Keys, Pyromalphic was apparently struggling to recover, for he remained within his lair beneath the ruins, yet the effect of his blight seemed minimal. Everblight, in marshalling his forces among the Nis and then the Ogren of the region, planned to put his weakened brother out of his misery. However, despite Everblight's fleeting desire to consume the power of a god, the slumbering Nisor's flight drew the attention of the Crixians, in particular Gorshay the Bastard, and the Khodorans, in the form of the Grey Lord Covenant. And while the Eldritch's assassination attempt against what was once one of his gods resulted in failure, the Grey Lord succeeded in stealing the vault in the aftermath. But for those who knew the vault's true value, it hardly mattered. Eris, Mage Hunter of Ios, bore witness to Nisor's temporary revival and passed word, via her fellow Mage Hunters, to Retribution Headquarters, Ios, and eventually the Consulate Court. With such knowledge, Ios stirred after signs from our borders in the aftermath of the War of the Houses and Gorshay's escape. Much of the Retribution's military was mobilized, and Mage Hunter cells were activated to secure Nisor, and though the senior Grey Lord Zerkova succeeded in evading an advanced strike force early in the Retribution's campaign, the Iosans were not to be denied, and a mixed force secured the vault to return Nisor to his sister's side. The journey taken was perilous, but the Retribution saw this most important of endeavours through, just as Ios was soon to be threatened by those invaders from the east who, after being held at bay by the Signarans, turned their attention to the north and the mountain passes that led into the Mistbow. With so much conflict throughout the Iron Kingdoms and beyond, a stalemate arose as all nations looked to their every neighbour with suspicion and weapons drawn. It would take a return to historic times and weapons of a bygone era to break the deadlock, but no matter what happened next, the war would not end.